Beza, you look so beautiful.
Okay, Dooms, can you make me the host, please? Okay, I'm starting, but just wait 30 seconds.
Good afternoon to all our online attendees and welcome to this webinar titled Futures of Circular Economy in SADC, Beyond Linear Economies. This webinar is hosted by the South African Institute of International Affairs, or commonly known as SAIA, which is an independent public policy think tank advancing a well-governed, peacefully engaged Africa. I'm Letitia Gentle from the SAIA Futures Program, and I will be moderating this webinar. This research was made possible by one of our funders, namely the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, or commonly known as CAS. We thank them for their contributions to support these new insights and alternative pathways as we delve into this important domain of circular economies in the SADC region. We have a packed agenda with esteemed panelists, and I'm sure you'd agree with me once I introduce them that we can't wait to hear their insights as well. First up on the agenda is the lead authors will provide a high-level overview of the research outcomes. This section will be led by Francois Pretorius, who is a senior researcher in the SAIA Futures Program. Our second lead author is Bezawat Esatu, a circular economy specialist for Ethiopia and an executive member at the African Circular Economy Network. She will be joining us from the US, and hopefully she is not too negatively impacted by the change in time zones. This presentation will be followed by a question and answer session with our panelists to further expand insights and knowledge. Let me introduce our panelists to you. We have Suzanne Kasha, co-founder and executive director of the African Circular Economy Network, followed by Paul Curry, director of Urban Systems, ICLEI, which stands for International Convention for Local Environmental Initiative. And last but not least, we have Peter Vandal, CEO at New Partnership for Africa's Development, NEPAD Business Foundation. We also have an open Q&A session where we invite all the online participants to share your insights, questions, comments in the chat, and I will pose those questions to our panelists and authors. I hope that you are as excited as I am to be part of this interactive dialogue where we expand on the edges of what is possible for the circular economy in the SADC region. Please keep your mobile devices close, as we will be asking you to participate and share your insights as well. In departing from the conventional linear economic model, the circular economy emerges as a transformative paradigm with the potential to concurrently address environmental concerns and propel economic development. Its pertinence is accentuated within the Southern African Development Community, or commonly known as SADC, where judicious management of abundant minerals and renewable energy resources is imperative. So despite the anticipated economic and environmental dividends, the transition to a truly circular economy remains intricate. While the research methods adopted futures research approaches, we've adopted a normative approach to what is commonly known as a possible or preferred future. While we expand our horizons by looking beyond the change curve and joining the dots on the periphery of what is possible, this research goes further by linking actions needed or strategic interventions in the present to navigate the nuances and pathways forward towards integrating circularity into new economic paradigms in the SADC region. The research positions that the SADC region can be at the forefront of circular economy innovations while embodying a harmonious balance between economic well-being and ecological sustainability. With that said, let me hand over to our authors of the research, namely Francois and Bezuit, who will share key outcomes with you. Thanks, Francois.
Thanks so much, Letitia. Yes, it's lovely to be with you. Before we start off, I thought just for interest sakes, I would like to get the audience's just feel in terms of what you think the main barriers are to the widespread adoption of a circular economy or circular economic practices in the SADC region. So with that, if you can just scan either the QR code or go to the link indicated, and just you'll see there are options to vote. I'm quickly going to exit from here and just go to the Mentimeter so we can actually present, hopefully, interesting findings. I'm going to give it 2 minutes if everybody can just vote and see what they think would be the most significant barrier. The options here are economic, technological, regulatory, educational, and then cultural barriers. We speak to all of these within the research. I just thought, let's do this as a litmus test to see if our research is speaking to what the room feels as well. To be expected, money talks. So we did think that would happen. So yeah, we've essentially got a interesting horse race going here, just in terms of what people think in the room. Thanks so much for partaking, everyone. It always keeps it interesting. There's nothing worse than a Mentimeter where nobody shares anything. So as you can see, it's quite evenly spread, and that is what our research touched upon as well. I'm going to go into the details now, and then I'm going to hand over to Beza to just take us through the policy recommendations as well. She is definitely more knowledgeable on the circular economy. I have the futures background. She has the circular economy background here. I just wanted to show that there is, in our minds as well, it was essentially like the ones that you have picked stand out as well. So thank you so much for voting on that. I'm going to go back to the presentation quickly, and then I'll just share here. So we've got an idea now. Money talks, regulation talks, all of these things do have an effect on the circular economy. And that was what we went in with, the idea just in terms of this research, where there's a lot of talk about the circular economy. From a futures perspective, we said, listen, let's take a critical futures lens towards the circular economy topic. Critical might sound very negative. In the futures jargon, it isn't necessarily negative. We are just looking at the underlying assumptions, the power dynamics, all of these things shaping the dominant narrative. And we're trying to excavate those and understand those a little bit better to understand what the circular economy could actually look like within the African context and then within the SADC context specifically. So as we say here, the idea is to address the power dynamics and narratives surrounding the circular economy in order to pave the way for meaningful system change. I know this will hopefully speak to Paul, who has a history he's really focused in systems analysis and systems thinking. So hopefully there's more people in the room who that appeals to. The research activities, just to give you a quick overview, we started with desktop research, where this was Beza did an incredible job. Her team and her specifically then interviewed quite a few different experts using what they call the 7 questions method, which was essentially getting all of these different experts to look at the circular economy within the region and then ask very specific questions that are futures focused. So looking at different various, we say futures, because the future is always plural. It depends on the decisions that we make now in terms of what could come to fruition. From that, we got really good insights in terms of what these experts think are the opportunities and the challenges. And we then took it to a strategic foresight workshop where we had a host of different stakeholders from all over the continent partaking in terms of students, but then also researchers across the board, basically. And we took them through 2 futures exercises. One is a causal layered analysis, which is really sort of at the heart of critical futures thinking in terms of understanding our biases that we carry and our own paradigms that we look out towards the world, basically, and specifically tailored to the circular economy here. And then we used another tool called a three horizons method, just in terms of looking where we ideally want to be, where are we now, and what needs to happen in between. With that, we then fed it back into what we call a seed gathering exercise. So here we are looking for new, interesting innovations happening on the continent that could, they're not mainstream at the moment, but they could become mainstream later on. And the idea with the paper is to point to threats and opportunities, but in the opportunities to give credence to these small seeds that really are gathering steam essentially and could change everything for the better on the continent. So that just resulted in the research, which we are launching now, and it is on our website. The first step for us was just to look at what are the drivers of the circular economy in Africa. I'm not going to go through all of these, but as you can see, population growth, big one in the African context. Rising middle class, urbanization, dense population. There's so many different things having an effect on the need for circularity and the need to rethink just how our economies operate and move away from linear thinking, take, make, break towards circularity in terms of just rethinking and redesigning how we actually interact with the natural world and how we build our economies accordingly. From there, we then took all of the different inputs and identified key challenges. The first one was the idea of more of the same. And this is just with regards to the circular economy idea, or notion rather, where a lot of thinkers say, listen, it's wonderful, but we're still working within a linear economic paradigm and we're essentially slapping a circular sticker on that. So that was something that came up. The second one was this idea of unmitigated growth in terms of GDP keeps on growing ad infinitum. With that, we are going to need natural resources. That led into the idea of the decoupling conundrum in terms of absolute decoupling, the idea of not using or using as few and lesser natural resources to keep the economy growing is also it's problematic. It's essentially showing that it can't really, it's not feasible in reality. Then something that came through quite clearly with the research is the idea of the dominance of the global north. Just in terms of in the actual research, we go into how many studies emanate from the global north and aren't actually necessarily just global south focused, and that there's a greater need for our voices in this discussion. With that, an additional factor that comes in is that circularity is nothing specifically that new in the African context, but it is very reliant on indigenous knowledge systems, and it doesn't necessarily get the credence that it deserves. So we just wanted to draw attention to all of these. If you read the report, you'll see we go into details on all of them, but it was this idea of taking a critical lens and just saying, listen, circularity is wonderful and we are really advocating for it, but we also need to be aware of the fact that it's not just an answer for everything and it's not going to be an easy journey. So with that, we then redeveloped a new definition, basically, that informed the rest of our study. And the idea was that the circular economy is a multi-level resource use system. Nobody's debating that. We put in that is sensitive to its contextual implementation. It needs to be contextually specific. And then also it's this idea of striving toward the complete closure of all resource loops. We know it's not necessarily going to happen 100%, but we need to keep striving for that. And that needs to form the basis of our thinking. So with that, we then essentially identified a host of different pathways towards circularity. There's sustainable agriculture and food systems, enhanced innovation, entrepreneurial systems. When you read the research, you'll see there's a lot of different things that we touch on that can be harnessed, and really interesting innovations that are happening on the African continent with regards to each of these things. We make mention of the African Circularity Network, all of the interesting things that are happening there. There's really, really interesting things bubbling up all over. And Beza was really amazing with this because she has incredible knowledge of what's happening on the continent. From there, we just looked at the barriers then to implementing full circularity, or circularity as we envision it, to essentially be implemented throughout the SADC region. So the idea here is that there's a lack of a uniform and inclusive regulatory framework. There's knowledge disparities in terms of different people interpret circularity differently. There's negative perceptions or resistance to change. And then there's also inadequate data available just in terms of tracking and tracing everything that is happening. So I'm going to hand you over to Beza, who's just going to take you through the 5 policy recommendations that we came up with, and then we will go on from there just into the session with the panelists.
Thank you, Francois. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'll briefly go through the 5 policy recommendations that we proposed after going through the whole process that Francois just presented. The first one is obviously regional collaboration and boundary sharing. The reason being, we believe circular economy, the impact of circular economy will be more visible and impactful if we aim for an economy of scale, and that happens when you have a regional framework and guidelines, and then also specifically for specific sectors which are actually outstanding in terms of economic feasibility or even environmental impact or job creation opportunities. So we believe the regional collaboration and boundary setting is something that should be prioritized. And then the next thing we believe, again, it comes with the fact that circular economy practices are already been in the continent, but it needed to be more expanded into other measures like implementing extended producer responsibilities along the value chain, but also measuring how much the transition or the adoption of the circular product is achieved. So that can only happen if we bring together a partnership or coalition of empowering stakeholders and communities to come together and bring the required platform to maximize impact. Third and most importantly, at the end of the day, we're talking about economy, and economy without any financial or business viable business is not something that's going to push to the next level. So we believe there should be developed physical and trade policies to support or enable circular economy. It could be ranging from tax incentives, subsidies, or even existing business models that are circular economy business models that need to be upscaled and replicated to some extent to all over the SADC member states. Again, bringing back to my first comment, what makes circular economy different from green economy is there is a little bit of one step ahead of designing products and services, which requires innovative intervention. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we should leave the whole thing, the indigenous existing, what is already working technologies and solutions, or even best practices. So balancing those two instead of starting from scratch would really make a big difference. And that goes all the way until the academic and research institutions, because that's where you need to bring the required change for the young graduates and entrepreneurs to come up with innovative products and services. And they are also willing to take risk to innovate and test their products and services. The last point is the point is without any capacity, implementing or even envisioning circular economy might not be practical. Not all engineers are expected to do something related to circular products and services. It could start from TVETs and small-scale enterprises who are exercising or learning the process or learning the curve and to transform towards circularity. So we believe reconceptualizing the waste management and the whole education and curricular system would really bring the required leap, if not smooth transition to the next phase. And we need to measure how those transitions are through key performance indicators. Like, for example, how many Tibet schools are now embracing repair, refurbish, and remanufacturing sectors as one curriculum the students should learn. How many of them are actually taking waste treatment plants, running those facilities as one curriculum? Those are the kind of things that we believe should bring the small incremental changes that will bring the long-term impact. So in a nutshell, these are the 5 policy recommendations that we suggest. But this is not for country specific. This is more for like all the SADC regions, the 16 countries. But there is a room for making sure that it is contextualized and downscaled or customized or tailored to each specific country's needs and opportunities. Back to you, Francois. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm muted. Thanks so much, Beza.
Thank you so much.
Letitia, I'm handing back to you. You can handle the questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Francois and Bezawit. You provide a very thorough and comprehensive view of the research outcomes. And I just want to invite everyone that the paper is also available in the chat. You can download it from there. So now we're going to head over to our panelists. And first up, we have Suzanne Kasha. So Suzanne, I just want to check, you still with us?
Yes, I'm here.
Yes. So I just have a few questions for you. And the first one is, what are the key challenges and opportunities in transitioning SADC countries towards a circular economy model? And how can the Africa Circular Economy Network collaborate with SADC governments and businesses to drive this transition?
Yes, I hope my replies are not as choppy as Letitia's question, because I really struggled. Can you hear me all well? Okay, cool.
I can hear you now.
Thank you so much. So yeah, okay, it's always easy to focus on the negatives first. So let's give you the negatives first. What brings us together is that we have very similar, very sad socioeconomic profiles in the SADC region. You know, there's a scarcity of skills, specifically technology-related skills, you know, specifically high-tech or IT-based system skills that would be able to increase efficiencies or accuracy and also resource productivity. It's basically none of those. We also don't have infrastructure that to really add value to what we're doing. I'll give you an example. I mean, we're extracting resources. We have a lot of critical raw materials, but we are all sitting under this resource curse, which was a term that was coined for countries that have a lot of wealthy resources and should actually be doing well. But, you know, it's actually other countries that take those resources that actually are benefiting from it. And I think one of the reasons why that is that we don't have any infrastructure really, you know, to add value and to create products of higher value commodities to actually trade, or even be more radical and rethink, do we really want to sell our resources in future or perhaps lease them to the global north? But that's a discussion for another time. And then, yeah, we have also a lot of poor people fighting for survival. What is typical for Africa is the Gini index. The GDP does not really tell us anything about how Africa is doing, because there's a few very rich people and a lot of poor people, and that might translate to not a bad GDP, but, you know, the Gini index really tells you the truth about inequity of wealth. And we have probably very similar Gini indexes. And I think what also, and that's close to my heart, is we are all in a linear locked-in position. Now, what does that mean? It means that we are in Africa targeted by industries such as the packaging industry, but also agriculture, to push into increasingly non-circular systems, or even replace it in indigenous circular systems like refilling systems by single-use packaging, and, you know, subsistence farming, replace it by industrial agriculture with clear financial interests coming from outside. And then I think from a legal perspective, and we saw there's also challenges, I agree, we have a plethora of national laws that are very often even conflicting. And then we have not really any that are exclusively oriented towards the circular economy. And what is important is that we have a circular economy-based regulation, because that would be really the future economic driver and would say this is the future economic growth strategy. Otherwise, it's always as like a side thought to say, okay, you know, it would be nice for the environment, but it needs to be actually a country's economic growth strategy. Otherwise, it's not going to work. Okay, and then also I think in the SADC countries, there are different departure points regarding very important regulation. What comes to mind is, for example, EPR regulations. South Africa does have EPR regulations for problematic waste streams, but other SADC countries don't have it. And you know, the EPR fees are a key driver on the polluters pay principle to make sure that problematic waste get actually collected and treated. So how do we overcome this? And then also finally, and then I'm coming up with the positive, is that, you know, I think African governments and the SADC region is deeply stuck in continuing to support fossil fuel-based and coal-based industries, you know, because there is this mineral wealth in those countries. And, you know, despite the fact that there are excellent opportunities into going into renewable energy, you know, based on solar income of all those countries, for example. So let's talk about the opportunities. I was last year invited to Botswana and Gaborone, and I learned there that the EU actually quite heavily supported the SADC region recently to develop a regional circular economy strategy. So there seems to be a circular economy strategy on the table already for SADC regions. And I think that is amazing. And what also brings us together is that the SADC countries have a lot of key value chains in common, and they can be prioritized together. So as long as we manage to actually create economies of scale, and I think that is important, we could really create a much higher value in those value chains. And what comes to mind there is renewable energy, food and beverages value chain, the mining sector, and those are just a few of them. And I think that would really offer key circular economic growth potentials if we will focus on this kind of opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that leads very well into my next question for you,
Okay.
Which is how can the Africa Circular Economy Network ensure that the circular economy transition in SADC is inclusive and responsive to the region's unique needs and contexts? I think Francois and Bezoa just earlier explained that they've expanded on the definition of what circular economy could mean within the SADC region. And they highlight the importance of context-specific. And also, I think we agree that the unique context of the SADC region, needs to be positioned. But given that, how do we cater for inclusive and responsiveness within the circular economy?
ASEAN has been started specifically in 2016 to become the voice of Africa, of what Africa needs from the circular economy to transition, because I was at the time in Davos and I heard the global North countries talking about product innovation and the Europe going into the Green Deal and the energy transition and how much money they're going to save. And I thought, if we're not really developing our own agenda of what we need, which has a much more social dimension to start with, we will be just steamrolled over by the global North. And why would I say that? Because I am German and I know this is the way it's going. Yeah. Okay. So I think unless we're not really very smart about what we need out of a circular economy agenda, other people will decide that for us and might not actually benefit us. So ASEAN is a knowledge network. We are actually represented in 42 countries in Africa and most of the SADC region countries as well. And I think what makes us really unique and strong is that we have this membership model where we're actually looking for a country members, and those members then form a chapter. So we have almost like our little agents in each of the countries that actually can provide exactly that specific cultural and socio-economic context that actually makes people identify with something. And I think that's important. And then we have also a very good track record that we can talk to governments quite nicely. And we have in the past been quite, influential there as well. We have, for example, worked side by side with the African Circular Economy Alliance. We have actively also advised our own government and government agencies at large. So I think ASEAN is in an excellent position both for the people of those SADC countries on the ground, but also the governments to build bridges of communication and understanding.
Thank you so much. You've, in a nutshell, said that SADC needs strategic foresight. One has to sit down and think, what is the future you want? And how do we align our resources, and how do we then implement our actions towards that? So very good response there. I think my last question, which is a bit of I don't call it a difficult question, but I think we all know that just measuring GDP on a country level, on a regional level, on a continental level is not sufficient. It does not meet the Sustainable Development Goals in terms of really driving change. So with that said, what alternative metrics and frameworks can the Africa Circular Economy Network promote to measure societal well-being and progress beyond just GDP growth in the context of the circular economy? I know a loaded question, but
that's fine. And this is my favorite question. I thought, what a pain when I saw the question, but I really had to apply my mind to this, and I loved it. So I said already before, the Gini index is for me a much more preferred measurement tool, because it really speaks about the inequity of wealth. And that is directly linked also that you can assess the level of corruption in an African country as well. It really also uncovers the real trickle-down effect of the wealth. Very often the GDP people come and say, yeah, if you increase your GDP, that will trickle down and everyone will eventually get rich. And I think that's absolute nonsense, okay? We really need to change the language, and all those terms like job creation and GDP, in the global north, we talk about an 8 to 5 job. That's not for Africa. Africa is a hustle economic kind of place, and we have to actually find our own key performance indicators. So the other ones that are out there, which are obviously including more social dimensions of how well are people doing, which is important, is the happiness index. And that was also something that was applied in the past, because it values social services that contribute to a sense of well-being. How well do you live in a country, they look after your children, or what other social services does a country offer? And then I start going deeper and thinking of what else could it be for SADC. And what I came up with was perhaps, how about the level of ecosystem-based commonage? We could measure that. That's fairly shared between SADC countries. So for example, water systems. How fair are those shared in the SADC systems? And then I think it's a huge discussion. You see, that certain countries in Africa are starting putting up dams and literally kind of letting dry out the rest. So, how much commonage is there in terms of water systems, of energy systems, protected natural areas? That could be key performance indicators to see how well are we doing together. And then also show me the degree of how much you harmonize crucial elements in a regulatory framework that drives circular economy. How much can SADC, for example, move towards a harmonized approach to EPR? How can we actually agree on combined renewable energy transition commitments? How can we actually show the world that we actively divest from fossil fuels and coals and do not allow for incineration of municipal solid waste? And then also the level of local self-reliance. And that was an eye-opener when we had all those riots in South Africa about 2 years ago, when Zuma was imprisoned and the country went crazy. And suddenly, there were entire regions, they were out of bread within 2 days, out of milk, out of bread. And people stood there with their hands up, and when they couldn't go shopping, they didn't know what to do and how to feed themselves. So I think that we go back and actually increase the local level of self-reliance and measure that for each of the SADC residents. It might not be ownership that people need, but access to everything that they need. So we need to perhaps replace this whole idea of I own and I shop to be providing access to what people need. And then finally, sustainable life skill development. I really, really feel very strongly, being a foreigner, but what I see, Africans should go back to their cultural roots. There is so much in the African culture that is actually intrinsically circular. You don't learn circularity from the global north. Circularity is born in Africa, and people must go back to their cultural roots, because there it is. and the knowledge of our forefathers. You don't have to learn some new tricks from the global north. Just go back and see what our forefathers did. And then finally, the level of decentralization of resource management. So I believe very much that we need to move away from globalization and really go back to decentralized, localized systems where people can actually create what they need, you know, in a closer radius where they live.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. I might circle back to you later on, depending on the questions, but for now, we're moving on to Paul Curry. I just want to see if I can see him.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, Paul. Welcome. Good to have you. So our first question is, can you share examples of circular economy initiatives that ICL-EI has supported in other regions that could apply to the SADC region and specifically the member states? And how can these be adapted to the local context?
Sure. Thanks so much. Glad to be here. My name's Paul. I am the director of the Urban Systems Unit at ICLEI Africa. We are a local government membership organization. So our entry point to this conversation is really asking, well, what is the role of local government in supporting sustainable urbanization? And of course, circular economy is an important topic to think about there. And it requires us grappling, well, what is the form of infrastructure that we currently have? Probably about a decade ago, a stat started circling saying that 60% of the built environment that Africa will need to house its 2050 population has yet to be built. Recently, the stat has turned to 80% of the built environment, but nevertheless, a huge amount of infrastructure and built city needs to be laid. And the idea of the statistic is to say, well, here's our opportunity. Let us not copy or follow the same development trajectory that the rest of the world has followed, but seek the opportunities to leapfrog. So here, can we create space to imagine what circular infrastructure, sustainable infrastructures can look like, and build those instead? So I think that's the sort of the worldview or the subtext to how we enter this conversation. And the second piece that enriches that is, well, asking, well, what do infrastructures in African cities currently look like? And one of my favorite projects, and I'm joining actually now from Germany, from Berlin, at the Nature of Cities Festival, which is about science, policy, and art. And similarly, Rise Africa is our platform to also try to run those sort of conversations. So I'm just going to share a project we ran in 2020, if I'm able to share screen. Yes. Which was called the Hidden Flows Project. And because we had minimal evidence and data around how much of water, food, waste, energy, industrial materials, construction materials is moving through African cities, is there another way to visualize what our infrastructures look like? And so we did a crowdsourcing project and invited residents from across the continent to share imagery around how resources move through their cities. And we used these images as a basis to host conversations with the photographers, with policymakers, with other artists, with people living in cities, with other urbanists or practitioners, community groups, and to try and make meaning, well, what are we seeing here? And the punchline of this long ramble is effectively, as you can see from these images, people are at the center of this, both as the recipients of the services and resources at the end of the infrastructures, but also they are infrastructure systems in of themselves. And here we speak quite blithely and quickly about the informal economy and informal systems, but this is the majority route that most people access resources. And the familiar punchline or the familiar remark is that if you want to do sustainability in Africa and much of the global south, you have to start with the questions of equity. And Suzanne has already mentioned Gini coefficient is a key thing to consider. But I think our offering is to really engage with, well, what makes these systems that are already servicing our cities work, and how do we invest in them? And here we have to step away from the very simplistic UN New Urban Agenda framing of, well, we must formalize them. Because the minute a local government officer says, well, we formalize them, so, well, what does that actually mean? Are you talking about planning? Are you talking about legality? Are you talking about regulation, taxation? Do we need to be taxing the very people who are offering these services? And so we need more nuance into how we speak about people in these systems and socio-technical infrastructures. So I've gone on a long ramble and kind of forgotten what the core of the key question was. What are we doing on circular economy? We are trying to shift the narrative. How do you excite people about what's already existing in cities and connect them to what we're excited about in the future? And how do you take these big words like circular economy, inclusivity, and say, well, when I walk out of my house, and these are the words of a Cape Town city official, when I walk out of my house, Paul, how will I know that I'm in an inclusive society? You know, what does it mean? And so it's to try and interrogate this. And so we've worked with a number of entrepreneurs through the Accelerating Circular Economy in Africa entrepreneurship program that we ran with Stellenbosch University Launch Lab, to say, well, what are the needs that entrepreneurs have to build circular businesses? We've worked with local governments to say, well, what does the system mean to you? And the piece here that I want to connect to the paper is our superpower, I think, in the global south is, it was referenced very quickly as this additional principle of circular economy. I would say radical contextualization, saying, what does this actually mean? And so for Accra, the director of the waste department says, well, for me, circular economy is about separating organic waste and all the other recyclables and making sure that I've got two clean streams of organic waste and other recyclables that other people can take care of. I'll use the organic waste for energy and use the sludge for urban agriculture. And by removing this waste and having clean waste streams, we will prevent flooding and disease in Accra. And so for many of us, we hear this and we say, oh, it's still waste management. And we're trying so hard to get people to think broadly about circular economy. But you know what? This is an amazing systems perspective that interprets the circular economy to a context. And that's our role, is to meet local governments where they are and to support them on a journey to incorporating these types of principles. And I'm sure we'll come to this in a future question.
Okay.
What's difficult about this is to do the circular economy, we have to be much more radical. Most of us here know that we are doing reform processes, nudging a system to try and become more circular. And so that narrative is still operating within the system, that we're not in a system that is yet ready for circular economy. We're in a capitalist, extractive, globally unequal world. And so what are the little things that we're able to do? While telling positive stories, we can hopefully plant seeds for a bit more radicalism, but at the moment, I'm not seeing that as our main contribution. Finally, the thing that we're doing for circular economy is to try and convince people that it is about time to collect proper data about the materiality of our society. A lot of great moves have been made around the continent, around the world, to develop national circular economy action plans. But most of these are driven by stakeholder consultation, which circulates the same ideas from exceedingly thoughtful people, no doubt. You know, I am part of these, and many of us are part of these, where we put forward what we hope or feel are the best things. But we need to start being a bit more critical and saying, I can't actually give you guidance because I don't have a material flow assessment of this system. I don't know how much water is moving through the system. I don't know how much construction material is moving through the system. And we need to become a bit more direct about saying, first we need the study, then we can make the informed guidance about how to improve or implement circular economy in these spaces. And I'm just noticing that the windows for calls to write these proposals are a year long, are, you know, delivered at very short notice, and it's just perpetuating a very quick roadmap that's going to look very similar for most countries around the continent, which is high level. Sorry, that's my soapbox at the moment.
That's fine. I just want to circle back to your stat that you provided on the built environment, you know, the whole concept of housing and the shortage of housing. So yeah, earlier this morning I read that I think Europe, if they comply to the requirements of the Paris Agreement, they can only build 176,000 houses by 2030. And that is significantly short of what is needed. And when one looks at the Africa context, and if you look at mass urbanization within the African continent, then that, what is needed and what can be provided in terms of those agreements become the delta becomes too big to close with traditional methods and models. Hence the need for an alternative paradigm. And I think what also comes out, which leads me to our next question, is that we've got some people with housing, and I want to work on this built environment topic that you started off with. But we also have some people with adequate housing in SADC and on the African continent. But how do we make this transition to the circular economy more inclusive, especially when we look at marginalized communities such as women, youth specifically? I think the unemployment rate for youth in South Africa is, bordering on 75%, which is horrific. So if we look at the circular economy through this different lens or a different paradigm, then how do we bring those people on the periphery of society into mainstream?
Well, I think the first is to acknowledge very clearly that all of us on this call are not the majority, and to try and partner with the organizations that do represent the majority, and to be thoughtful, deep listeners, and then to offer our skills into those processes, not to lead or hold or do a top-down route, but to say, well, what evidence, what ideas do you need? I think there's a bit of an assumption sometimes that we produce evidence and people will just use it, but there's a whole lot of work that we need to do as researchers, as intermediary organizations to support people to see where evidence can be useful, and for us to acknowledge where it's not, where actually this is a political decision or it's motivated by a whole set of other choices. But I will come back to an evidence point, and I've got a really nice diagram just on this question of inclusivity from the Cape Town water crisis. And this is the data that was shared during the on the open data platform, and just through some very simple correlation. And there's a beautiful paper that's come out, I believe, in 2022 that shows the consumption of water over time as well. But if we spatialize how consumption is connected to income and density, these are two big determinants. The city of Cape Town, we've got our higher income suburbs on the west and north part of the metro, and then our higher density, typically through informal settlements in the middle of the metro area. And there are three key policy outcomes you can have on water. So if you spatialize access to water, and here access meaning that there's a tap within your own yard, within your own property, access to water is fine in our low density, high income. But as expected, we've got low access in these high density areas. So your policy directive is we need to find better ways to provide the infrastructure that offers access. So in the conversation around circular economy, reusing resources, you can't forget that access to these resources is your first priority in unequal society. Second point is then the highest consumption in total of water is also in the high density, low income areas, because this is where more people are, and water is correlated quite directly to people. So here we need to think about, well, how are we providing bulk water into these spaces? The City of Cape Town is doing really interesting experimentation with water reuse at one of the water plants in this area. And so there's a whole set of cultural norms that need to be engaged about, well, do people feel comfortable drinking fully recycled water, as is done in many parts of the world? In Singapore, there was a fabulous story about needing to do sensitization that recycled water is halal. Because if you've got meat abattoirs also having runoff into a circular water system, are people going to feel comfortable with that? And then finally, for your high-income suburbs, for liters of consumption per person per day, that's also aligned very much with higher income. And so here is where you can deploy demand-side management, ask people to say, reduce your consumption, because you can't ask people who are getting less than 50 liters a day to reduce their consumption in the whole of the city when they're not. So that gives us some nuance to apply these data in different ways, looking over time, looking over space. That sidestepped, I think, your bigger cultural question of inclusivity and future cities. And there, I think we need much more radical questions. And a point where I'll disagree with Suzanne is this question of how do we go back to culture? Is that possible? You know, most of us are addicted to these iPhones. We use these. These are part of who we are. We're now cyborgs. Are we able to convince the majority that they should not have these, that their lifestyle should be simpler, that our lifestyle cycles should be simpler? Are we actually able and willing to make that choice and that sacrifice? Because that's radical. If we all decide as people connected in to put down our phones, to actually shun this. And I think that would be incredibly important and powerful, but I'm not seeing the indicators that are willing and able to do that.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you for sharing those graphics. I'm sure it would look the same for energy.
Very similar, absolutely.
Very similar, yes, with energy access, you know, and overlaying that with
quality of food nutrition, you know, where the majority of concrete is moving. You know, we spoke about built environment. People are building their own houses. You know, the formal just view them as not good enough. So how do we invest in these spaces so people can build dignified housing themselves? Or does the state need to be the deployer of housing? These are further questions.
Thank you so much. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to move over to Peter Van Dal. Peter, I just want to make sure that I can see you.
You got me. I'm here.
Okay, great. Welcome, Peter. Yeah, so Peter's the CEO at the New Partnerships for Africa's Development Business Foundation, or commonly known as NEPAD. Peter, the first question to you is, how can the NEPAD Business Foundation encourage the private sector in SADC to embrace more transformative and disruptive circular economy models that challenge the status quo? So I suppose another way to put that question is, if the business case is there, what's stopping the implementation?
So thanks, Letitia. Maybe just to position us in this discussion, just to start. So at the NEPAD Business Foundation, we host the SADC Business Council. So by extension, I'm also the executive director of the SADC Business Council, which is what it says in the label. It's a regional organization making up regional business associations and regional businesses, really working with SADC as our key counterpart. Why we're in this discussion is, on an annual basis, we have something called SADC Industrialization Week, which is intended to support SADC member states with their industrialization agenda. And in 2021, there was an opportunity brought to us by one of our private sector members, Coca-Cola, saying, how can we start to have a regional view around waste management, and to start generating a common view amongst businesses that are affected by this topic. So we launched it in 2021 via SADC Industrialization Week. There was a call to formalize some form of structure. And then we were fortunate to get some support from the EU Africa Rise facility, who we worked with sort of 2022, 23, to try and understand what was the regional play, what was required, what was needed. And the output of that was the creation of a regional circular economy platform, with the basis of that being working on extended producer responsibility, waste management, circular economy. So that's why we're here, and why we're part of this discussion. What is the reality at a regional level? And it kind of informs the work that we're doing at the moment. the reality at a regional level is there needs to be some level of rationalization and consolidation of what is viable. So if you just take plastics as an example, the sort of the model tells you that there's lots of waste but not enough place to recycle it. So economies of scale become quite an important thing. So a lot of our work at this point in time is to try and rationalize what a regional master plan, regional strategy looks like, taking into account where waste is being generated, collected, and where it needs to go to in order to leverage economies of scale in the recycling process. What that does is you start to get supply demand linkages. What that does is it starts to kick out what are the logistical aspects related to that. So straight away you'll start to find that there's trade issues, there's trade barrier issues, there's trade facilitation issues, issues around HS code, can you move waste cross borders, etc. So our core focus is on working with SADC on rationalizing what a regional market looks like, whilst at the same time realizing that ultimately this is a local issue. So EPR, which was mentioned earlier by Suzanne, EPR policy harmonization is important. Maybe not full harmonization, but at least having EPR policies in different countries that we can use to springboard off is important. So again, we've partnered with EU Africa Rise in this space to work on a couple of pilots. Pilot's probably the wrong word, but initial transactions. So we're working in Lusaka on creating an EPR PRO transaction for Lusaka. And there's also one being done in Rwanda. Long way around, and it's coming back to your question, is what can we do? A lot of this is about information and sharing and popularizing what the direction of travel is, what the opportunities are, both as consumers, as manufacturers, but then also as people operating in the waste management space. Perhaps just to touch briefly, again, Susan mentioned it earlier, the fact that SADC does have an industrialization strategy, a circular economy strategy. Maybe just to pull a couple of key points out of that. They have prioritized certain value chains for the region. So it's the renewable energy value chain, it's the food and beverages, it's the mining sector, and it's construction and building materials. So I think it aligns a lot of many of the conversations we've had already. But the key to it, in terms of mobilizing and encouraging the private sector to get involved, is they acknowledge that they need partnerships. They need partnerships with countries, with implementing partners, with development partners, with businesses, with consumers, with sector stakeholders that will ultimately deliver these services. And behind that, obviously, is a whole resource mobilization game, and making sure that we start to do some transactions and learn from those transactions and start to share those messages and those learnings with the broader community. So that's why we're delighted. Thank you very much for inviting us today. We're delighted to share what will be a journey for us, and we would love to utilize these sort of platforms to share the findings as we progress.
Thank you so much, Peter. I just want to probe back into something that you mentioned earlier about supply and demand issues, which inevitably creep up as one goes into new sectors and new industries. And you positioned it in the sense that, more partnerships are needed to really focus on resource mobilization. And we know that supply demand it's a dynamic. What do you think could be done to somehow get equilibrium towards the circular economy by looking at supply and demand factors?
Let me put my caveat. I'm not an expert in this field, but I'll try to answer. In the day, there's a need and there's an opportunity to deal with it, right? So We know waste has been generated. We know that it's going to landfills. We know that it conceptually can be collected and isolated. But in order to head towards equilibrium, you then need to transform it back to something that can be reused in another format. Now, there needs to be a business case around that, or there needs to be subsidies in that space. So the only way you're going to get equilibrium is by ensuring that people are able to invest in that processing capability to bring it towards equilibrium. So that's why I talk about the supply and demand. We need to rationalize about how you create something of scale that has sufficient feedstock to justify the investment that will ultimately bring you back towards equilibrium. And at the moment, as I understand it, and again, I'm not an expert in this field, I understand there's capability in South Africa and Namibia. So, I guess at this point, they're still trying to rationalize the volumes that they are dealing with. And how do you make sure that the rest of the region is able to take advantage of those investments that have been made?
Thank you so much, Peter. I don't know why you say you're not an expert in this field, because you're definitely bringing some very new insights. My next question for you is, how can the NEPAD Business Foundation work with SADC governments to develop circular economy policies and regulations grounded in realistic assessments of the region's economic and environmental realities? So I definitely agree with you. We've got these policies, in place. We've got the SADC industrialization strategy, the circular economy strategy. I think SAIA previously, I think it might be 2021 and 2022, where SAIA actually presented research at the SADC Industrialization Week. And so we've got these forums, we've got these policies, and it just feels like there's something stopping, circular economy when it comes, where the rubber hits the tar. And the research also talks about these barriers that we encounter. But in your view, how can we circumvent those barriers? And I know, the circular economy talks about a paradigm shift. And maybe that's a key thing that's needed. But I'd like to get your view, considering that you're so close to the business network.
Yeah, so I think we need to understand what the roles of different institutions are. So the function of SADC and SADC member states is to harmonize, to provide guidance. It's to say this is best practice, and to develop those regional views about how should we develop our region in any particular topic. The reality, though, is execution is at a national level. And the big gap has always been at transitioning the regional view to execution at a national and in case of waste, even at a municipal level. So that's what the gap that we're trying to plug. We know that there are many partners that are interested in this type of work. We think that the policy space is fairly well known and what needs to be done, but it's going and creating those policies that do then exist at a national level, that are business friendly, looking towards achieving what they're intended to achieve, and making sure then that you build off of those national policies into specific projects. So our interest has always been around mobilizing resources, partners, stakeholders, interested parties around executing at a more national and local level.
Great. Thanks so much. I see we have quite a few questions in the chat. I just want to go there, and then I think our first question from Ronald Ruchasha, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Is there a plan to reduce conversion of land for development in SADC, thereby leave room for nature? I think the question there is to reduce the conversion of land for development, and then is there enough room for nature? We also have the ACEN, how to become a member, and those links have been provided. I think also contributor contributions to Suzanne's comments about indices, which is the Human Development Index, which is also quite a good recommendation. We have another question from Ronald, which is the Global North have an obligation to assist with skills and technology needed for the transition to the circular economy. Maybe I can ask Suzanne, I think this question came up while you were presenting your comments. What is your view on that?
Yeah, my view is that this is really overdue, and I think now we have the opportunity, and there's those buzzwords, just transition. But what does it mean? It would really mean that we are meeting on the same eye level with the global north, and that would mean that we have to rethink our current trade schemes, because every single trade scheme that's currently in place is actually for the advantage of the global north. So I think that's where it would already start. And then to actually be bold enough, seeing that we are at the moment in such high demand because Europe needs now, or not just Europe, but the global north for their energy transition, they need now all those raw materials that Africa has. Are we really wanting to selling out ourselves a second time around, or are we smarter this time and we're actually claiming a better position in the global value chain? We could, for example, put all kinds of terms and conditions if we want to sell our resources. We could say, okay, we sell you the resources, but you invest in infrastructure so we can add value to resources first, so we can sell them at a higher price. Or we could be even bolder and say, why do we want to sell you in the first place? Can we start to think about leasing materials as a service? So we would stay, actually, our countries could stay the owner of our resources. And I think Botswana has started looking into this, where the government retains ownership of what they export. But my thinking goes further to say we could create royalties for people on the ground that could be supported. For example, mining communities that now kind of need to be retrained in the just transition, and those royalties could be used, that can be generated from mines, by leasing certain resources. Those royalties could be used to rehabilitate mines and actually transform mining communities. So I think we should be a bit more innovative in how we're giving our stuff away going forward.
Thanks so much, Suzanne. We have another question from Ronald, and the question is, in many SADC countries, construction for human settlements and infrastructure is much needed, yet skills for sustainable construction are hard to come by. So how do we bridge this gap? Francois, I know you just finished some research on skills development, which was focused on South Africa, but if you would like to come in, you're welcome to. And then I think, Paul, I'd like to hear your views on this question as well, which talks about skills for sustainable construction within the SADC region or within the SADC countries.
Thanks, Letitia. I was so excited when I saw this question. Thank you, Ronald. Just in terms of, it speaks to just research that we launched last week, Monday, actually, and that was focused on skills development within the TVET sector, specifically for the green hydrogen economy. So it ties in very nicely with this. It's not infrastructure specific, but we do touch upon it in the research there as well, just in terms of this very specific need that we have in the continent in terms of sustainable development, but driving it through vocational and technical skills, so that it's not just the resort of universities, essentially, and it's not just the exclusive domain, but that it's in the general domain as well. So I'm going to refer you back to that research, which we will also post afterwards. Then you can have a look at it. But it's a very good question to ask, because in that we also touch on the fact that there's not enough foresight being brought to the table when you look at skills in the South African, and then for that matter in the SADC context. Just in terms of long-term views, we sort of always are on the back foot in terms of responding to what is happening now and plugging points as it comes along, as the problems come along. And there is a real need to just start embedding strategic foresight and skills foresight, which is foresight specifically for skills development, just into the whole ecosystem, so that we can start planning with circularity in mind from the get-go and years in advance, basically. Paul, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thanks. I mean, my initial response maybe is a bit coy, but I think if government policy sets the demand, if there are policies that express the need for local content requirements in certain types of building and set very clear parameters for how private sector developers must attend to in terms of what principles they must offer, in terms of what materials they must use, portions of social housing, any of those, the skills will follow, and it may take some time. But if there is a clear demand and people see that they can build businesses or living out of it, my sense is the skills will follow us. There are a lot of really interesting young entrepreneurs or new businesses that are emerging around earth-based technologies, around these interesting hybrid technologies, and they're very exciting, but I think they feel a bit helpless because they've got an idea and a passion, but don't see the funding arriving, don't hear the validation in the form of an economic opportunity. So I think if these policies and strategies and roadmaps of the circular economy that we're busy investing in can be quite daring, I think the skills will come. At the moment, we have a brain drain where people are leaving because they aren't seeing space for them to exercise their skills. So that's from the other side. Of course, then in terms of upskilling people in systems thinking, upskilling people in these specific technologies, that then is the domain of our education and TVET and training.
Thanks so much, Francois and Paul. I'm just looking, we've got Mark from Ireland, and Peter, I think there's a call to connect with Mark. He's given his details. Peter, if you like, I suppose that other people would also like to get in contact with you. If you are comfortable to do so, you can share your email address on the chat and also make some more contacts there. There's another question, which is, can you provide details of funding in the form of grant or debt organizations in South Africa for circular economy projects? And that question is from Matsamela. Any answers to that? Maybe Francois and Bezowit, maybe you came across that when you did the literature reviews.
Beza, I don't know if you want to jump in.
Honestly, so far for specific SMEs, it is the African Circular Economy Facility, which is providing this kind of support, like direct financial support. And then there are calls that are floated by different development partners. But in general, countries have not yet set up a facility for funding opportunities, and what's out there is the calls that are floated by different organizations. For example, UNDP, UNIDO, ILO. These are the kind of organizations. For example, today there was a global youth impact for ILO working on circular economy affiliated with climate change projects only. Clean air pollution control kind of projects. So those are the opportunities out there. But in terms of bigger support, organizations like GIZ, UNIDO, UNEP, and others are supporting technical support also. This is as much as possible I can summarize. And then also I really encourage everyone to register to our newsletter, a monthly newsletter, where we share this kind of opportunities. It's free of charge. You just need to be part of our Friends of ASIN membership, and we share those calls, compile and share those calls every month in our newsletter. Thank you.
Beza, can I ask you to maybe just share the link in the chat? So I'm sure people would like to join your newsletter. Just with regards to answer this question, I know that there's funding. Also, I think if you go into the South African government funding websites. There's specific funding, but also fundings geared towards females in circular economy projects. So you might find some useful information there. We also have a question from Skalk Burger from Engineering News. And the question is, how can different practices common in Africa, such as the reuse of packaging and bringing own packages, as an example, help to reduce change or negate the need for logistics in circular and thereby ease the pressure of material flows? And how can we innovate the reuse or movement of materials for circularity, such as potentially local processing or reuse of materials?
Letitia, I'm happy to jump in on this one.
Okay, good.
I'm just going to speak to, I did some research about a year ago in terms of solar panels in South Africa and looking at the opportunities that are available with regards to recycling. And this is such a wonderful question, because what we're also trying to position with regards to this paper is this idea of, it's not just challenges. There are really good opportunities in the circular economy all around for people to actually start engaging with it and actually start making a living from it and making money from it. So that is, we sort of forget that the economy part of the circular economy is also key, just in terms of what it looks like. So with regards to that, there's definitely a lot of things that we can focus on in the SADC region in South Africa that is working, and look at ways of being innovative and expanding on that by essentially looking at the business side of things. So that would be my 2 cents on that.
Thank you very much, Francois. And I think our last question, I think, Beza, if you can take this one, it talks to what is your favorite example of the SADC region where a cluster of stakeholders have come together and delivered significant change in relation to circular economy, and what made it successful?
I will pick up on the obvious coalition which was set up by the South African government to support the research institutions for funding to do specific circular economy projects. It was launched in 2023, and I'm pretty much sure it's still around. But that's the kind of initiative I would envisage to have on board, as at least as a platform level, so that the private sectors, the industrial manufacturers, and then the government itself would be on board. Yeah, that's my favorite one.
Great.
And in terms of product, I am always a big fan of traditional materials which were changed into circular products, and the one that made a brick which was made by Botswana Research Institute to with the special kind of sand construct the high demand for urban areas is something that's also good. And Italy, of course, poly is also there. Those are the kinds of initiatives that we really need to have on board to push the whole thing front. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Beza. Suzanne, would you like to add as well?
Yes, I'd like to add to that. I think one of the industries that's really also ripe for this type of SADC regionalized approach is the e-waste industry. I mean, we are very fortunate in South Africa that we have some state-of-the-art recyclers sitting, and we have quite advanced recycling going on and very specialized recycling. But what all the countries lack is end processing facilities, and an end processing facility is a very costly affair, and you need to create economies of scale. Now, I think in order to justify an end processing facility, and that is actually where the value of the resources can be retained, because at the moment Africa loses twice. We're giving away our primary resources, then the stuff comes back as e-waste, we take it apart, and then we send it back again, and the good stuff gets still again recovered in Europe or somewhere, So I think, in order to retain our resources of real wealth, we need this end processing facilities. Now, we have obviously things to overcome, like Basel Convention, which have been put in for a good reason, to protect us from getting hazardous waste dumped on developing countries without consent and things like that. But I think if we would establish green channels between countries where e-waste can flow in a controlled manner and where the governments have an agreement that this is acceptable, where e-waste can then flow, for example, to South Africa, to those recyclers that are there. They have then obviously a motivation to increase their capacities because they can secure economies of scale. I think that would be very, very powerful as a pilot project to initiate.
Great, thanks so much. And thank you, Francois, for also sharing the article on solar panel recycling. I think that's the last of the questions.
Letitia?
Yes, sorry.
Can I jump in on Scott's question? Because I thought it was very interesting. I think a lot of us are sort of scratching our heads a bit, because this is the crux of it. We've seen circular practices, but how do we do them? How do we get widespread uptake of them? And I think just to add to Francois' sort of point, I see two elements here. One is social norms. So as a guide, and not an answer to the question, but a guide to how we might think about this, people I think will genuinely pick the route that is healthy, affordable, that is healthy, good for the environment, that is good for equity, social outcomes, if it's affordable and easy. And so I think if we think about principles of how do we get these different services or resource movements to be affordable and easy for people to make those choices without going out of their own way, that's one. And then we've moved away from this paradigm of inclusive urbanism or inclusive infrastructure where the state provides large-scale infrastructures. And we've done so mainly because we don't have the resources available to build such. But I think it begs a sort of a re-questioning about how we might engage with that as a paradigm that everyone should have access to certain things. So water, for example, we use so much water for our everyday needs that it does make sense for that to be through a centralized service, because it's just much more affordable once you've invested in the infrastructure. But then questions about organic waste and other types of logistics, those could be down to ward level. There are really interesting programs around organic waste collection and treatment that are happening by communities treated in that space. So organic waste that's water, that's heavy, doesn't have to get transported all the way to another treatment facility. So I think those types of models are interesting. And thinking across the different types of commodities or services and designing infrastructures around their weight or their volume could be a route to think about this.
Letitia, just as a last plug for the paper. So Paul, we do speak to all of those things in the paper, specifically the idea of changing cultural norms, because I mean, that is one of the key things in the African context. So there's all sorts of interesting things in the paper. So I am just plugging it again. Please go read it.
Thank you, Francois. I'd really like to thank our panelists for your insights. It has been exceptionally valuable. I just want to go through some closing remarks and also just look at next steps, definitely looking at what we've covered. I think this was quite, one would describe this webinar as a mouthful. We spoke about a lot of things. I think firstly, we had the Mentimeter, and I think it's sometimes the Mentimeter can be a bit nerve-wracking because your research says one thing, and then you run a poll, and then the poll is something different. But what happened in this instance was that the poll confirmed what the research findings were, which was quite good. We picked up there's a lot of talk about the circular economy, and we need to shape or rethink the dominant narrative about what circularity should look like within the African context. We've also had Francois and Beza would share their research activities, and I think more importantly is highlight the pockets of the future and the present. So we can see these pockets of excellence of the circular economy really, embracing all the aspects of the circular economy. The problem is that it stays a pocket. It's not moving into mainstream. We also looked at the key drivers of circular economy and, what is causing a push away from these linear economies to integrating more circularity. And I think in there lies the nuggets that we need to get to. Also reviewed challenges, and I think a very interesting graphic that Francois demonstrated was, the challenges look like a domino. If you stack dominoes next to each other and you push the one, then, you know, all the dominoes go. And I think that's the problem with the challenges of the circular economy, that it's also interconnected. You know, if you have a challenge with the one thing, it touches on the next thing, and then you just have this major house of cards falling flat. And therefore, I think that underpins this, you know, necessity for an alternative paradigm. It's about how through what lens are we going to, you know, expand our thinking on circularity. We also looked at I think very important, the expanded definition of the circular economy and the importance of including context within that, and the unique context of the African continent. I think Bezawat also identified key pathways in the form of policy recommendations of how one could really scale up the circular economy. We also looked at the barriers, what's holding the system, what's holding the present system at play. And I think it's always very difficult to change a prevailing system, but it can be done. Yeah, Bezawat also highlighted, you know, the steps that one can do to actually get maximum impact in the circular economy. Then we went on to Suzanne, and Suzanne provided quite, you know, very good insights in terms of infrastructure to trade and resell or release the resources to the global north. You know, we need to think about what do we want circular economy to do and to look like for the African continent. And I think once we can answer that question, then we would know how to trade or choose better pathways for trade. We also looked at circular economy-based regulation and the future of economic growth strategies and different departure points, especially for EPRs. And I think a very key point which Suzanne pointed out is that the region is deeply stuck in fossil fuels. But as we know, all systems can die out. Yeah, also the regional circular economies strategy on the table. There's key value chains that need to be prioritized to really scale up the uptake on circular economy business models. So, you know, what Africa needs from the circular economy is, I think we spoke about the Green Deal, and not importantly, or not less important, but the social dimension, you know, where one needs to look at strategic foresight. So, you know, how are people adjusting to circular economy practices? And we also looked at the whole concept of the Gini index, the Gini coefficient, and, you know, the need to focus on alternative metrics, let alone GDP. I think the audience also mentioned looking at the happiness index, and also the level of ecosystem-based commons, the water systems, energy systems, etc. And just to add on to that, I think the Futures Program always advocates for the well-being economy, which is very much linked to that. Yeah, so then we moved on to Paul, and Paul, I need to thank you for your very impressive graphics. It was very good to look at that. You added, you brought in new concepts such as the built environment, and also how resources flow. Your first graphic demonstrates that, you know, we don't have infrastructure on the African continent, but we've got all these people, and these people make things happen. And how do we leverage that? How do we move forward with that within the circularity paradigms? Very important question. It starts at equity and ownership. You know, so and we know that that model is very distorted within our existing economic paradigm, and I suppose we're all looking towards circularity to somehow change that. We need to definitely shift the narrative, as you rightly pointed out, and accelerate the circular economy in Africa. What's needed is entrepreneurs. We need lots of entrepreneurs to really shape up and move radical contextualization. there's a need to also partner with majority and partner with majority and minority groups to offer skills into minority groups and processes. And I want to thank you for that point as well. I think that's also quite something crisp and something new that, that one can take and really apply in different spaces. Also the need for development partners towards inclusivity. I think gone are the days of you either doing research or you a private sector or public sector. I think we all have the space and the capacities to become development partners. And how much we embrace that will determine how successful we can be, in our future endeavors. We ended off with Peter. And I think you provided very good, realistic feedback in terms of the SADC Business Council, what the council is all about, what do these structures do, what are the intents, and also the SADC Industrialization Week. And I'd also like to encourage our online attendees, if you can attend it, please do. Very, very interesting, always interesting. And I think Coca-Cola, the fact that you mentioned Coca-Cola is quite significant. I think there's a study also by, I forgot about who did the study now, but the point is that if you look at the salary of the CEO of Coca-Cola, and you look at the negative externalities of Coca-Cola with all the plastics and waste in oceans and rivers, and you compare the salaries of people trying to do a societal good or societal or really uplift societies, and then I think it's something like 23 times in factor. So I'm not negatively downscaling what Coca-Cola is doing, but I think there's a definite onus on the private sector to not only look at profit, but to also look at the positive and negative externalities of their products and their production processes. So I really hope you continue to work with Coca-Cola within the region and really drive the circular economy practices there. Also, Peter, thank you for bringing this whole real conversation in terms of what is viable. There is waste, but not enough space to recycle. And I think that talks to, we really need to rethink how we set up cities and structures and infrastructure so that waste becomes top of mind and not a add-on at the end. Also, I think very much important for any business or economic model is supply and demand. And we would have to really, manage that and try to get to equilibrium as fast and as quickly as possible. So with that said, I'd really like to thank our esteemed panelists. It has been wonderful to have you. You've each brought a very fresh and new insights, which I'm sure we can all take with us and really present further. I'd like to ask you, if you can, to please just rate us. I think Pippa uploaded our webinar feedback form. We'd like to know what worked well and what we can do to improve future webinars. With that, thank you very much. It's been wonderful to have you. And I wish you all the best in your circular economy journey. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Stay well.